This week, I'm back revisiting a shape you may have seen me previously throw, yet this time we're following up with the trimming, the glazing, and the firing. This bottle went from being a shape I was really sceptical about to one that I actually really like. It's strange how that happens sometimes, and I think it occasionally takes living with an object for a while before you get to that point. My range of pots has been missing a bottle, a form with a narrow neck and a somewhat bulbous body, and my plan is to throw a shape that approximates what I have in my mind. Then I'll take a photo of it, take it into Photoshop, and demonstrate how I play around in order to find new shapes that I might want to throw. For this bottle, I'm going to be using about 1.5 kilograms, which is about 3 pounds, 5 ounces. Due to the pot's angular shape with a narrow neck and a flaring rim, I'll be using clay that's really quite firm. This will make it harder to wedge and centre, but it means, as I'm throwing the pot, the clay will have a lot more strength, and it will take a much longer time for it to degrade as it's saturated with water. But before I begin throwing with it, I first need to wedge it up thoroughly. This mixes the clay body, and as the stoneware is forced into a spiral that gets smaller and smaller, any air pockets inside are gradually stretched and popped. I then slightly alter the position of my hands, use less pressure, and roll it into a conical shape like this with a rounded bottom. This way, when the lump of clay is chucked onto the wheelhead, it can't trap any air underneath it. And if you do want to check if your clay is wedged, simply cut it in half and look for any air pockets, or texture in the form of layers and spirals. If any of those three things are still present, then the lump of clay needs to be wedged more. It's then taken over to the wheel and slammed down in the centre, making sure it's thrown against a dry surface, relatively. You don't want it sopping wet, as if there is a ton of water beneath the lump of clay, it simply won't stick. And when you begin to put pressure on it with your hands, it will simply hydroplane off. I use the rings on the wheelhead to help me identify when the piece of clay is positioned centrally. I then use my index finger to seal the lump of clay around the bottom, and with that I can begin centering properly. So I spin the wheel quickly, use plenty of water, anchor my arms into my torso so they're really stable, and I normally begin by just compressing the lump of clay down before letting the excess be pushed into the centre, and it's this material which I cone up, squeezing it firmly with the palms of my hands from either side. This cone of clay is then compressed back down, and I repeat this process a number of times. Coning helps to mix the clay even more thoroughly, and it even helps to align the particles the clay is made up from, as when the cone is guided down, the particles collapse and align with one another. And after a short while, with the clay centred and the lump spinning without any sort of undulation in it, it's forced down into a puck-like shape with a flat top and sides. With the clay now fully centred, the next step is to open it up. This means creating a hollow of sorts in the centre, which is gradually opened up to form the internal base of the bottle. For this process, I cup the lump of clay with my hands, but use my index finger and thumb to push down in the very centre to create a V-shaped opening. I obviously can't push all the way through to the metal wheelhead. Instead, I aim to leave about a centimetre in the very bottom. It's better to have slightly too much than too little, as you can always trim excess clay away, but adding additional material to the bottom, whilst possible, isn't something you should be doing regularly, as it adds considerable time to the making process. So, once I've achieved that depth of about 1 centimetre in the bottom, I don't push down any further. Instead, I glide my fingertips horizontally across the bottom to form the base of the pot. In fact, from this point, I make a note to never push down on the base at all. As one of my tutors used to say, it's sacrosanct. You can check the thickness though, which I do with a needle tool. The metal is pushed through, I put a finger on the base, and then I see how much of the needle has sunk through. And it was just fractionally thick for my liking, so I'll push it down further to make it thinner, directing the clay from the middle into the walls on the outside, where it's available to pull up into the walls of the bottle. The next thing I do to thin out those walls a bit is sling some water over them, and then I collar them in from either side. Always working the clay inward into a conical shape, as if you let the material flare out too much, it becomes more difficult to control. This is why, generally speaking, after each pull, I'll collar the walls in from bottom to top to keep the cylinder in a more controlled shape. And from this point, I'll begin pulling on the outside using a soaked sponge, pinching against fingertips on the inside. They compress the wall of clay at the base and then very gradually move up together. And if you find any material does come off and stick to your pot and spin around like so, it's simply best to ignore it until you've finished your pull. Then you can go back and get rid of it. I then collar the cylinder in, like I mentioned previously, controlling and compressing the top so it spins without any movement. If the rim of your cylinder is wavering all over the place, you really will have a much more difficult time creating even and consistent cylinders like this. For that reason, if you notice the rim is wavering an awful lot, it's best to simply deal with it, which you can do by slicing away a small portion of the top using a potter's needle. I push the clay in around the base and press it about a centimetre or so in. Then from the outside I press out to create a bulge, and it's this lump that I lift up, my fingers on the inside slightly higher than those on the outside, where the sponge is being pushed against. And the key here really is consistency. You want to move your hands up at an even rate, with even wheel speed and an even amount of pressure between your fingers. If any of these are off, the process of throwing simply becomes more difficult. With the cylinder feeling nice and thin and evenly thrown, I'll get started on shaping it. I hold the kidney against the pot, marking the profile I want, and I push the clay from the inside out against it, holding the tool as steady as I can and eventually raising the tool up as my hand reaches higher and higher. I want the lower 2/3 of this pot to taper inward. Then, somewhere towards the top, it'll slope in, and it's from here that the neck will spring from. I feel as if that skirt of clay around the base does add some strength and stability to the shape overall, so I won't remove it until towards the end of the process. Next, I'm going to start throwing some height on the upper section. As the clay here is collared in, the walls get thicker, which means the walls can then be stretched and thrown taller, then they can be collared in again, made thicker, and thrown again, and so on and so forth, until the neck portion is as tall as you want, or you run out of clay. You can see at the top, as I'm collaring in, that I wrap a finger around the rim. This just helps me to keep it under control, as it's really common when you're collaring in like this for an undulation to develop in the lip. It's only subtle, but there is some movement, but I'll deal with it in a few pulls time, as you can sort of negate this undulation as you're pulling the walls up. I do this by pressing down an index finger on top of the wall as I pull it up. Sometimes this works really well, and sometimes the wobble might be a bit too severe, in which case it's best to sever away the unevenness with a needle or a turning tool. Either way, this tends to be a process where there's rather a lot of back and forth. It's not something you want to rush, especially throwing the narrow portion at the top, as it can so easily twist and come off in your hands if you work a bit too roughly. And with that, I just do some finishing touches on the delicate lip, shaping the wall in such a way that the beveled edge comes to a point on the outer portion of the wall, instead of it being simply rounded or even angling in slightly, which is how it might look if you beveled it the other way round. I should note that before I began really collaring it in, I made sure that there was no water left trapped inside. And finally, the bottle was wired off and placed onto a bat. This way I can pick the pot up and move it around simply by lifting up the wood, preventing me from handling the soft clay vessel itself. It's a really simple shape that matches many of my other pots in terms of their angularity. I think the neck could be slightly too narrow for how wide the shoulder is, but I'm sure when I turn this vessel it will become more slender. And here's how I use Photoshop to quickly test out numerous different shapes. I delete the background, and then I can use the Transform Distort tool to alter the vessel in loads of different ways. I make a page worth of ideas, and eventually, further down the line when I come to revisit this shape, I'll print this out and use it as a reference as I throw a batch of bottles. It's way faster doing this as compared to actually throwing all of these on the wheel, and I can very quickly discover a direction I prefer together with the other direction that I definitely don't want to make, or simply feel as if they don't fit into the Florian Gadsby aesthetic. And I think out of all of these, the one I want to try next is the bottle second to the left on the bottom row. And to dry this pot easily overnight, I'm just going to stick a bucket over it, as the last thing I want this pot to do, especially with its narrow neck, is for it to warp and distort too much, which can happen with cylindrical pots if they're left out overnight and dry unevenly from one side. It's now a few days later and the bottle is perfectly leather hard. This won't be the easiest shape to trim, but for the time being, turning it the right way up will be relatively straightforward. It's when I flip it over onto its rim that things will get a bit more tricky. I begin, as always, by attaching the pot down to the wheel head in such a way that there's nothing supporting it or holding it in place, such as lumps of clay or mechanical arms like you find on Giffen grips. The reason being that if I attach it to the wheel with some slip underneath the bottle, then I can trim the entirety of the walls without anything getting in the way. I'll begin by turning the shoulder and the lower half, thinning the walls where I know they were a touch thicker and taking in the tapering section at the bottom so that the base is narrower. I think having a base that isn't quite so wide will help with the overall shape and proportion, and I'm leaving the top to last so that I can trim it to match the rest of the shape proportionally. With the majority of the trimming being done with tungsten carbide blades, I often have to scrape back over the surface with a flat kidney, like this, to get rid of the worst of the making marks or the light chattering that's a really common occurrence with these tools, especially if you're turning grogged clay. I of course have to be a bit more careful when turning the neck, but it isn't wafer thin, so I can afford to remove some amount of material. I just have to be vigilant and check it constantly, as the last thing I want to do at this stage is make it too thin and ruin the entire pot. And after narrowing the profile a bit more, I smooth over this area once again with the kidney to create a surface that's smooth, as ultimately my glazes work best, I think, on surfaces that are relatively flush and even. And the last thing I do is burnish the rim to make it lovely and smooth, as it had become quite sharp and gritty, and if I were to flip this bottle upside down onto that edge, there's a chance it could chip, as it is really quite dry at this point. And that's my dog. He'll often do this after we've gone for a walk, when he's a bit damp from running through tall grass. And I think all he really wants is to be warm, despite having a lovely spot on his bed underneath the radiator.
You can't go on my lap. No, why you want to be on my lap?
Obviously, what he really wants is to be held. Spoiled boy. All that's left to trim now is the base, so the first thing I have to do is separate the pot from the wheel. I begin by scraping away the excess clay around it, and then I slide the sharp metal tip of this knife underneath the pot, catching the bottle with my left hand as soon as it dislodges, and I scrape away the excess left on the wheel as I'm going to be placing this pot upside down on its rim, and I certainly don't want any of that clay to press into the rim I've just carefully finished. Now, I don't have some sophisticated method for attaching this pot in place as I trim the base. In fact, all I'm going to do is get it centered, and then I'm going to press 3 big lumps of clay around the neck, making sure the neck itself isn't distorted as I press this clay against it. It's really not perfect, but it works, especially with the help of the spinner tool placed on top, through which I can apply considerable downward pressure, helping to keep the whole assemblage steady. Yet when that tool's removed when it comes to trim the actual base, instead of relying on the tool to push down through, I'm now using the blade itself and my fingertips, and I switch between them as I'm trimming, depending on which part of the foot I have to turn. Now, it might not be absolutely 100% perfect. The vessel is wavering ever so slightly as it spins, and that'll translate into how I trim this foot itself. But after this pot has been turned, nobody's ever going to place it back upside down, spin it quickly, and observe how well centered the foot ring is. As long as it's 90 to 95% there, I'm happy with that. I also find when turning higher up like this, it's helpful to rest my right elbow on something, in this case a bag of soft clay, which does a good job of being both sturdy and comfortable at the same time, whilst helping me keep that right hand steady. The final step with the foot is to burnish the bottom edges so that the clay here is lovely and smooth. And finally, I stamp the base with my maker's mark. and it's lost about half its weight overall. It's a lovely and light vessel, and I prefer its shape now that it's been trimmed, but it's going to change even more after it's been glazed and reduction fired. But first, it needs to be bisque fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. This hardens the clay as it becomes partly vitrified, whilst also making it porous, which makes glazing it, at least the conventional way, possible. That's what's just happened to all of these pieces, a process that takes about 2 days in my electric kiln, which is more or less a gigantic toaster with a lid, with much thicker elements. Before the pot can be glazed though, I first need to wax the foot ring. It's scented, carefully. And then I brush a layer of wax emulsion around the foot ring, being very careful not to get it anywhere I eventually want glazed to be, as, just like with many other mediums, the application of wax creates a wax resist. And in this instance, the water contained in the glazes I use won't be able to be absorbed through the wax, and therefore none of the glaze itself should stick to the foot. Now, here comes the fun part. I think glazing this vessel is probably going to be the trickiest part of the process. I begin by filling the foot ring with a small amount of glaze and then quickly tipping it back into the bucket. Next, I stuff my fingers into the opening and I'm going to push it into the glaze like this, being very careful not to let it tip to one side, which it's really trying to do. All the air in the bulbous portion of the bottle is trying to push upward, so keeping it straight and stable is a challenge. I then lift it out and set it aside, and the following day, after the outside layer has dried, I can pour glaze inside, swirl it around and then tip it out. And this is where perhaps the most annoying mistake happened, which is spilling glaze over the exterior surface that was so evenly glazed before. Now I'm going to have to fuss around an awful lot to take it back to that lovely flush surface I want. The rest is easy. Due to the pot having a sharp lip, the glaze flows out really easily without peeling back over the exterior form. I try to get about 2 or 3 rotations in if I can. This way the glaze will coat the interior in a thick enough layer. I try to get rid of the worst of this spillage straight away, but when fettling over it at this stage, the wet glaze tends to try and pull away the dry glaze underneath it. So instead, I waited until the following day when these proud drips had fully dried, at which point they were quite easy to scrape back with a flat kidney, as I could sort of use the glaze underneath like a guide, scraping back these thicker sections until they were flush with that. It's straightforward, but a pain, as it added about 10 or 15 minutes to the glazing time of this bottle. Although at least it's rather satisfying, I suppose. The thing is, had I left these drips, they would have remained visible on the finished object. The glass would have had a slight bump, resembling the shapes these drips had. If I threw my pots to be wobbly, so that they had a lot more movement in them, drips like this could actually look rather nice. But with the angular, straight shapes I make, it's just too much of a contrast, and they just don't feel like one of my pots. So I'm diligent in how I remove mistakes like this. Yet, at the same time, I have to be very careful not to make any area too thin, as in the same way a thick patch makes a notable difference on the surface, a thin patch does exactly the same. In the case with this glaze, it would create a small brown patch amongst an otherwise uniform dark green. I also make sure that none of the glaze around the rim is sitting proud, nor do I want it to be too thick around this point, as I threw this edge to be thin and delicate, so if it is overwhelmed with glaze, it does sort of defeat the point. Next, I begin work on the base, which, had I not spilt glaze all over this, would have been the part that required the most attention. The glaze in the footwell is fettled to a smooth surface, and then the foot ring itself is really carefully sponged clean. I want the area where the glaze meets the clay to be lovely and crisp, without any sort of undulation or unevenness. Potters inspect the bottoms of other pots all the time. It's the section where a potter has had to make a few decisions about how they decide to conclude their pots. And whether they're left really scruffy or neat, they need to at least feel considered and match the aesthetic of the rest of the pot to some degree. It's now a few days later. The bottle has been packed into my gas kiln, which you can just about see top left, and it's here where it'll undergo a second firing to a hotter temperature. A reduction firing in my gas kiln, to be more specific. It takes about 9 hours from beginning to end, and it's entirely manual, unlike my electric kiln, which is fired automatically. There's a lot more to reduction firing, and if you would like to learn more about it, I recommend watching some of my other videos, as it's a somewhat convoluted process, although it's remarkably simple and easy once you get used to it. It's now a few days later, and the kiln is cool enough to unpack. This specific kiln load cooled over the weekend, which means it's now about 60 degrees inside, and I'll be able to unpack the pots immediately, whereas there are other times, say if I'm unpacking the kiln a day earlier, where the pots inside remain scalding hot, and I have to be a bit more careful about how I take them out. So far, it all looks good, although there are always a few surprises tucked inside, be it disasters or successes. I tend to have a good look around with the torch first, and after I've taken a few photographs, I'll begin to unpack it properly. And here's that simple vase. I have a really horrible feeling that the glaze inside the foot might have stuck the pot down, but it came off easily. This glaze is generally really stable, and it barely moves beyond where it's applied, meaning you can get lovely glazed feet, like this, if the footwell is deep enough. The bare clay itself always becomes coarse again after being fired, as the stoneware itself shrinks more than the pre-fired ceramic material, the grog, the clay body contains. So I give it a polish with a diamond pad just to take the edge off, or really so it won't scratch your tabletop. And here's the finished bottle, clad in a dark green felspathic crackle glaze that's covered the shape in a wonderfully uniform layer. You'd really never know that drip was there, and honestly, despite disliking this pot for a long time, I actually really like it. It's sleek and slender, with a narrow neck, and it's really a pot that's all about the shape. The foot glazed really well, despite my apprehension of this glaze dripping slightly and fusing to the kiln shelf. And it also breaks on those sharper edges to slightly warmer tones where the iron-rich clay begins to shine through. And I think this has given me the confidence to try out some of the designs you saw me Photoshop earlier, as I've never really made very many bottles like this in my range, but I think my body of work benefit from it, as they're great standalone pots to have, simply as decorative objects, or for a simple display of flowers. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch. Let me know what you think of this bottle, or vase, really. The distinction between each is interesting, I think. Just a reminder, but next weekend will be my online shop restock, November the 24th, 2024 at 7 PM GMT. I'll leave more details about that in the description of this video. And, as always, I'll see you next time.